Hello everybody, and thank you for joining me for another tier list. Today we're going to be going through the discography of the Turtles, another great band that was an important contributor to 60s music. And similar to some other groups that I've covered, they are a band that I would say are pretty overlooked by a lot of people. And while they were only a band for a short period of time and may not have left behind the legacy of a group like the Beatles or some of the other big bands of the 60s, I still think that they are a very important group that contributed some very awesome music between their tasteful songwriting styles, their interesting interpretations of covers, and their goofy sense of humor that I think was another defining trait of the Turtles and their sound and image. They also have a lot of really great deep cuts and B-sides hidden throughout each of their albums, and I always love bands that have a lot of hidden gems throughout their discography. And I think for anybody who is a fan of 60s music, it is well worth exploring their albums. It's not super expansive, but there are a lot of hidden gems all throughout these albums. So I'm happy to be covering them for today's episode, and what I'm going to do is go through 6 albums, starting with their 5 studio albums, going from It Ain't Me Babe up to Turtle Soup, and I will also be including the compilation album Wooden Head because it consists of unreleased songs that were not on the first 5 albums, so I figured it was worth covering that album as well. So I'm going to go through these 6 albums, and I will score each of them on this tier list, with S being the highest and D being the lowest, and I'll talk a little bit about each album, let you know my thoughts, and we will see where we end up. And please feel free to let me know your thoughts in the comments, where you agree and disagree, and how you would rank these 6 albums. I would love to hear your thoughts. Alright, I think that's about it. Let's jump right into it. Okay, starting out, we have their debut studio album from 1965 titled It Ain't Me Babe, and I will give this one an A. I think this is a really solid first release. I wouldn't say it's a perfect album, but it's still very enjoyable, and I would consider it to be one of the more underrated albums of 1965. Stylistically, this one is largely in that folk rock realm, and that genre of music had been experiencing some success in the early to mid 60s, and the album consists of 8 covers and 4 originals, with the 4 originals being written by Howard Kaylan. And the covers feature 3 Bob Dylan songs and then a variety of different choices for the other 5 songs. And I think the majority of the songs on here are very enjoyable. There are a couple of tracks that I don't find particularly exciting, and that is why I would say it's not a perfect album and why I did place it in A tier. But there are definitely some really big high points throughout this 12-song track list. I think the opening track, Wandering Kind, is amazing. Howard's only original song from side 1, and a great introduction to the sound and his compositional style. For the remainder of side 1, we have 5 covers, and I think 3 of them are awesome. It Was a Very Good Year is an amazing song, and I really love their interpretation of that. I also love their take on Eve of Destruction, and Let Me Be Me is the perfect 60s pop song, and anytime they do a track written by P.F. Sloan, I think it's always amazing. The couple of songs that I could do without on side 1 are Your Ma Saw You Cried and Glitter and Gold. I think those are the 2 weak points of side 1, but other than those 2 tracks, I think all 4 of these selections are very strong. Then on side 2, we get a mixture of 3 Howard Kaylan originals and 3 Bob Dylan covers. I would say stylistically, side 2 does have some moments that branch out a little bit from that folk rock style, and some of Howard's songs have these slight elements of psychedelic to them, at least to my ears. But I do think side 2 is stronger than side 1. There are a couple of real high points, like the cover of Bob Dylan's It Ain't Me Babe, which was actually this band's first single and the song that was responsible for getting this album made. And I think the other 2 Bob Dylan covers are very nice too, with Love Mine Is Zero / No Limit and Like a Rolling Stone. And I also really enjoy all 3 of Howard's originals as well, my favorite one being Last Laugh. I would say Wandering Kind and Last Laugh are my 2 favorite originals from this album. But like I said, I don't think it's a perfect album. I do think there are a couple of dips on side 1. But in the midst of that, I think all of Howard's originals are solid, and the majority of the covers are very enjoyable too. So I would say this is a very good first release. I will give this an A. Alright, next we have their second studio album from 1966 titled You Baby, and unfortunately I'm going to give this one a C. Not a great album in my opinion, and I would say that this is a pretty big downgrade from the first release. Stylistically, this one still has a few of those folk rock elements, but it also veers off into some more pop and rock territories. We have 12 tracks with 4 originals and 8 covers, this time 3 being written by Howard and 1 written by Al Nickel, and side 1 is 6 songs songs with 4 covers, 1 Howard original, and the opening track Flying High is the Al Nickel original. And for me personally, on side 1, I actually resonate more with the covers than the originals. Flying High and House of Pain are 2 Turtles originals that I find kind of underwhelming in the grand scheme of their discography, and I don't think they match up with the quality of the originals from the first album. My favorite cover on side 1 by far is I Know That You'll Be There. Again, a perfect pop rock song choice and another solid track written by P.F. Sloan, which I'm always a fan of. I think track 5, I Need Someone, is okay, but I wouldn't say it's anything exceptional. And I think Just a Room is a cool song, probably my second favorite on side 1. And then for track 6, we have another recording of Let Me Be, which is a great song, but since it was already released on the previous album, I feel like counting this song as something in favor of this record almost feels like cheating. Then for side 2, we have 6 more tracks with 4 covers and 2 Howard originals. And again, I resonate more with the covers on here for whatever reason. I'm not particularly crazy about Paul Bearing, Ball Bearing World, or the closing track, Almost There. To me, they just have kind of this generic 60s rock sound to them that really doesn't do much for me, but that's just my opinion. Side 2 does have a couple of covers that I really enjoy, though, with Give Love a Trial, You Baby, and All My Problems. Give Love a Trial is the perfect tender folk rock choice, and You Baby is the perfect 60s pop rock song, and again, a great track written by P.F. Sloan and Steve Barry. That would be my favorite song from this album, and I do think side 2 is a tad better and has some stronger individual tracks, but in general, this album is kind of all over the place. It has some high points, but it does have a good chunk of songs that I find pretty underwhelming, and I don't find the originals to be as strong as the originals from It Ain't Me, Babe. And it seems like they were at a weird point in their career stylistically where they weren't sure if they wanted to move forward with that folk rock sound or if they wanted to go into more of a pop rock sort of direction. But I think you could kind of hear that throughout these songs, and one of the reasons why it's not as cohesive as the first release. I think if they had kept this album more in a similar vein to It Ain't Me, Babe, it would have been better. But regardless of that, there are a handful of really solid tracks, but unfortunately for me, there is a decent amount of songs on here that do take away from the album a lot. So I wish I could give it a higher score, but unfortunately, I'm going to have to give this a C. Alright, next we have their third studio album from 1967 titled Happy Together, and this one gets an easy S, an absolutely amazing album, and in my opinion, the best Turtles album, hands down. After the release of You Baby, the band needed to reassess what direction they wanted to go in stylistically, and they had lost their original drummer and bass player, so it was time to regroup and figure out where they wanted to go next, and I think this album is the perfect new direction for them to go in. At this point, the folk elements are gone, and we are getting into more pop rock and psychedelic elements, which I think was a very fitting stylistic choice for 1967. This album has 11 tracks and only features 4 originals, so again, we're not getting a ton of originals on these first couple of albums, and it also has 7 covers, with a couple of the tracks being written by Bonner and Gordon, and I think every song they wrote on here was a home run, and in general, I think every single song on here is great. The 4 originals are great, and the choice and interpretations of the cover songs are top-notch. We also hear the instrumentation getting a little more stretched out with a horn section and a string section on select songs, which really adds a nice additional layer of beauty to these tracks. Side 1 has 6 songs with 4 covers and 2 originals, and every single song on side 1 I think is awesome. Obviously, Happy Together is their most popular song and one of the big standouts on side 1, but I also equally enjoy Me About You and Think I'll Run Away. In my opinion, Think I'll Run Away is the strongest original that they have written up to this point in their discography. And then side 2 hits us with 2 more originals and 3 covers. Again, I think every song on side 2 is awesome. My personal favorites are Too Young to Be One, She'd Rather Be With Me, and Rugs of Woods and Flowers. I think the blend of the more energetic rock tracks against the couple more mellow songs like I Think I'll Run Away, Too Young to Be One, and the Warren Zevon cover of Like the Seasons create this very nice blend of styles that makes the album feel very cohesive and just fly right by. And I would say of their entire discography, this is the one that has the strongest back-to-back track listing and the best choice of covers, as well as the largest amount of my favorite Turtles songs like Happy Together, Think I'll Run Away, Me About You, and Too Young to Be One. So yeah, I think they knocked it out of the park with this album and did about as good of a job as they could have with regrouping after You Baby and putting out an amazing album, and in my opinion, one of the most underrated underrated albums of the 60s. So an incredible release, my favorite Turtles album. This one gets an easy S. Okay, next we have their fourth studio album from 1968 titled The Turtles Present the Battle of the Bands, and I will give this a B. I think this album is okay. I wouldn't say it's amazing, but it's not terrible either. And a lot of people seem to be all over the place in terms of where they place this album, because some people really love it, but I've never been able to get into it as much as some other people. At the time that this was written and released, it was an interesting time for the group because they were having a lot of problems with their management and their singles weren't charting very well. And because they had a lot of success with the Happy Together album followed by this dip in momentum, it left them in a weird spot yet again where they're trying to regroup and figure out where they want to go next. And this is a concept album where they are pretending to be a different band with each song, and each track is stylistically different from one another, and it features 9 originals and 3 covers. And the way that this album had actually ended up coming to fruition was that Howard had started writing a joke song, sort of like a parody of Happy Together, which was a track on here titled Eleanor, and it actually ended up hitting number 6, and the record company unexpectedly liked the song, which resulted in them making an entire album based off of that idea. So initially started as a joke, ended up becoming this new concept album that they put out. And side 1 has 6 songs with 5 originals and 1 song written by Harry Nilsson and Chip Douglas. And for me, these songs can be hit or miss. There are some that I enjoy, but also some that stylistically I don't resonate with as much. And I think that is one of the reasons why this album is so all over the place with how people rank it, because stylistically, they are doing a lot of things that are outside of what we had heard on the first 3 albums. So some people may like that, but other people might not be a fan of every single song on here, and that's kind of where I always tend to fall into. For side 1, I really enjoy The Last Thing I Remember and Eleanor. I would consider those both to be amazing Turtles tracks, but unfortunately the remainder of side 1 is largely underwhelming to me, and personally I don't find the choices in styles to be very exciting. I do think that side 2 does get a little bit stronger though, and does redeem the album a little bit, and it features another 6 songs with 4 of them being originals. For this side, I think Surfer Dan is an okay song, getting into that Beach Boys surf rock sort of vibe, and I also like Food, and Chicken Little Was Right is a cool song. And I also enjoy the closer, Earth Anthem, which ends the album on a very pretty folk number. But my number 1 favorite song on this album by far is You Showed Me, which was written by Roger McGuinn and Gene Clark of the Byrds. This song is absolutely incredible. It's so beautiful, and it would probably even make my top 10 favorite Turtles song list. And that is definitely the big high point of this record for me. And like I said, I do think side 2 is the stronger part of the album. I just find some of the stylistic choices to be more exciting on here, whereas I think side 1 has a lot of songs that sound a little bit more generic and sound just kind of like straightforward rock songs, which I don't find as exciting as some of the other stuff that they do. So I would say this is a pretty good album for what it is, for being spawned out of a joke. I think they did a good job of replicating a lot of different styles and a lot of different bands' sounds. But because of that, it's going to result in some songs that people don't always resonate with. And for me, it's really, those handful of tracks on side 1 that do take away from this album a bit. But like I said, I do think side 2 is great. And side 1 does have a couple of tracks that I do really enjoy as well. So an okay album, a bit of a downgrade from Happy Together, but I do think it is stronger than You Baby. So I will give this one a B. Okay, next we have their 5th and final studio album from 1969 titled Turtle Soup, and I'm actually going to give this one an A. I think this is a very good album, and it's really unfortunate that this would end up being their last album that they would put out, because I think this record was released at an interesting time for the band. They had the big success of the Happy Together album, and then tried the Battle of the Bands album afterwards, and I think once again they were sort of left in this weird position where they're still trying to figure out where they want to go next as a band. And I think this record made some stylistic shifts that were very good, and I think the songwriting sounds very mature, and it sounds like a group that was beginning to evolve into a new type of sound that could have been very exciting. We also have Ray Davis of the Kinks doing production on this, which adds a whole nother amazing additional layer to this album, and it features 12 tracks with 6 on each side, and all of them are originals. This is their first and only album to feature all original material, which is another thing that I really like about it, and something I would have loved to see more on future releases. Of the 6 tracks on side 1, I think the majority of them are very strong. It's got a track here and there that I'm not super crazy about, like the opener, Come Over. I actually like the second section of the song a lot, but I've always found the opening part to be pretty bland and generic sounding, and I don't think it was the strongest track to choose for opening up the album because I do think it's kind of misleading, and I think the music gets much better and more interesting from this point on. I'm also not super crazy about the track Torn Between Temptations either, but other than those two, I think the other 4 tracks on side 1 are really good, with my favorites being House on the Hill and Love in the City. I really love that some of these tracks are starting to get some more Baroque pop and Baroque rock elements in them as well, with some of the instrumentations and the way the sections are orchestrated. For the 6 tracks on side 2, I have very similar feelings to side 1. There are 4 that I really enjoy and 2 that I'm not crazy about, which are Bachelor Mother and Hot Little Hands. And it seems like a common trend for me on this album is that the tracks that are kind of more straight ahead rock songs I'm not as interested in, but the songs that are kind of veering off into some more art rock and Baroque rock sorts of territories I do really enjoy a lot, and I think all 4 of the other songs on side 2 are amazing. My 2 favorites would be John and Julie and You Don't Have to Walk in the Rain. I would consider both of those to be exceptional songs, and You Don't Have to Walk in the Rain might also be my favorite closing track of any Turtles album. And throughout this album there is just a lot of really high quality tracks, and although it does have 4 songs I'm not crazy about, I think the remaining 8 songs are so strong and such an improvement from Battle of the Bands that I couldn't feel right putting it anywhere but A tier. They did a really great job of defining a new style for themselves to build off of moving forward, but unfortunately this would be the last album that they would release, so we wouldn't get to hear that sound continue to develop. But regardless of that, this is a great last album to go out on. I will give this one an A. Okay, and lastly, we have a compilation album released in 1970 titled Wooden Head. Before I get to my score of this one, I'll give you a little backstory as to how this album came to be. After the release of Turtle Soup, the band had been having a lot of issues with White Whale Records, and they actually found out that the record label owed them hundreds of thousands of dollars that they didn't pay them. And obviously, this led to a lot of friction between both of them, and things continued to get worse and worse between the two parties. And they did have plans of releasing a 6th album titled Shell Shock, but it was never finished and didn't get released at that time. And White Whale ended up releasing a compilation album of unreleased tracks from the You Baby sessions and put it onto an album, which is this, titled Wooden Head. As far as my score goes, I think I'm going to give this one a C. I have a lot of mixed feelings about this record. I think it's okay, but I do find a good chunk of it largely underwhelming. It does have a few songs scattered throughout that I do find enjoyable, but unfortunately it also does have a good share of skip over tracks that I think take away from the momentum a bit. I think the opening of the album is the strongest point, particularly the opening 2 tracks, which I think are awesome, with I Can't Stop and She'll Come Back. Both very strong songs, and I think if they had been used on the You Baby album in place of some other tracks, it could have greatly enhanced that album as well. I also enjoy I Get Out of Breath and On a Summer's Day, but those are the only 4 on here that I would say are really good tracks, and the remainder of the songs for me are a mixture of songs that I don't like and some other songs that I think are just okay. The ones I'm not crazy about are Get Away, Wrong from the Start, and Say Girl. To be fair though, it's not like these songs were written with the idea of them being put together in this fashion on an album, so it almost seems unfair to score these by regular album standards, but since it does consist of all unreleased music, it felt like it should be included in this discography. I think the strongest song on here by far is She'll Come Back. I think that's an exceptionally beautiful song, and for me, it is one of the main tracks that really carries this album. And like I said, I think the momentum is the highest with the opening 2 tracks, and then it dips and comes back up in a few moments, but largely becomes kind of boring from the majority of track 3 and onward, in my opinion. So not the greatest compilation, but it does have a few hidden gems throughout it that make it a little more tolerable, so I will give this one a C. Alright, so that is it. I went through their 5 studio albums and their compilation album, and this is what I came up with. A couple of these albums did take a few more listens to really solidify my thoughts on them, but after a bunch of listens of each, I can confidently say that these are my takes on their albums. Like I said, I recommend their discography to anyone who is a fan of 60s music. There's so many great songs to dig into and a couple of really solid albums as well. And another band that I think left behind some very very high quality music of the 60s. And another band that I think is a great contributor to that decade and has a lot of really great deep cuts and B-sides that are worthy of exploring. So that is it for today. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope it was informative. And if you are interested, please feel free to check out some of my other tier lists linked in the comments and the descriptions. I've done a good handful of 60s bands and artists up to this point, and I have plans of doing a lot more, so I'm sure there will be something else that you like. So please check those out. And like I said, please feel free to let me know your thoughts in the comments, where you agree and disagree and how you would rank these 6 albums. I would love to hear your thoughts. All right, that's it for today. Thanks again for listening, and I will see you at the next video. Take care.